In this video, we are going to talk about lessons learned from running Blazor in production. This talk is partly from the perspective of running Blazor in production, but also helping developers in forums, Reddit, and stuff like that. We're also going to take a quick intro look at Blazor, because a lot of developers haven't tried it yet. Now, Blazor. Some love it, some haven't tried it yet. So I'm a little bit curious. Who is using Blazor today? Who wants to use Blazor? And who are a little bit unsure about Blazor? Write in the comments. My name is Jimmy Engström. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been running Blazor in production since its release back in 2019. I'm the co-host of Coding Off the Work podcast, a Twitch channel, and YouTube channel. We talk to a lot of interesting guests on the podcast. Sometimes we invite them to the stream, and sometimes we live code and work on some project. Right now, we're building a Blazor call for paper site. So please check that out if you're interested. I've written a book about Blazor, and the second edition just came out. It's all good new .NET 7 content. Now, these are the only two books about Blazor that has raccoons on the cover. But enough about me. Let's talk about Blazor. At NDC Oslo in 2017, Steve Sanderson had a WebAssembly talk. He thought, wouldn't it be kind of cool if I could run C# with WebAssembly? So he took an open source version of the C# runtime. He compiled that to WebAssembly. And when he takes the stage, he has working IntelliSense, he has, working C# code running inside a web browser. He even had the name Blazor, which is kind of mind-blowing. So why is Blazor so awesome? Well, I saw a post on Reddit that embodied it so well. This is exactly what I think as well. It feels like cheating. I feel like I'm getting away with something. And it shouldn't be this easy to build sites. Now, me included, I'm not very comfortable with JavaScript. But with Blazor, there's no switching between JavaScript or TypeScript. You don't have to download another framework. And there's no extra skills involved like React or Angular. I read somewhere that Blazor is for developers that don't like to learn new things. And that is definitely not the case for me. How I see it is misfortune never comes alone. And that misfortune for me is NPM, Webpack, TypeScript, JavaScript, Bower, Angular, React, all of those things that I have to learn and understand. Now, you can only be the best at one thing. So for me, this removes clutter. It gives me the opportunity to focus on one language, one workflow. And that's where Blazor comes in. I was contacted by someone on Facebook, and I meet a lot of people, so I added him as a friend. And he said, are you working with Blazor? Yes, I am. This is going to be a fun conversation. And he crossed his arm. Well, I don't know if he actually did that, but I felt like he crossed his arm and he said, never going to be a thing. Why do you think that? Well, it's never going to beat Angular or React. And I'm like, well, that is not the point. It's not meant to replace or kill another framework. This is not, there can be more than one. It's not Highlander. I did a similar talk like this at NDC, and apparently this expression I have here, let me see there, was A very good one. So he tweeted this image and he said, you know what? You heard it here first, or something like that. That tweet has been seen over 20,000 times. The response was insane. It was retweeted a bunch of times. And I think that the discussions were very interesting. Now, apparently, this expression was so much fun, so it actually became a meme as well. So I guess thank you. But again, it's not the point. It's not supposed to replace anything. Now, Blazor is not another SPA framework. It's not another framework. It's part of .NET. So if you are a .NET developer, you should consider Blazor. There's no reason not to use Blazor, really. Now, it's kind of crazy because we still call it Microsoft New SPA framework, but it's almost 4 years old. And I mean, most projects doesn't even see 4 years. I talked to a school where I teach. It's a accelerated learning school. So you go from 0 to developer in 12 weeks. So I said, would you like me to teach Blazor in the school as well? Well, no, not a lot of companies are looking for Blazor knowledge. Oh. But are they asking for ASP.NET developers? And they were. They were not asking for web forms or MVC either. So, again, it's part of .NET. Now, we do ask for Angular or React developers because it's not part of .NET. It's something different. But Blazor, again, is part of the .NET ecosystem. Now, another problem with Blazor is that it runs on the server. It runs in the browser, and it runs on any platform with .NET MAUI, which leads us into a naming problem. I talked to a podcast about making an episode on Blazor, and they said, well, we just had an episode on WebAssembly, so I don't think it's the right time right now. And this is a very common misconception. Blazor is not WebAssembly. It's so much more. Last year, we did a podcast with Steve Sanderson, and I asked him if he was seeing the same thing that I did. Because I talked to a lot of companies, a lot of developers, and most of the developers I talked to are saying we're using Blazor Server. Only a small percentage of the people I meet are using WebAssembly. And he was seeing the same thing. Now, granted, WebAssembly is not as old as Blazor Server. And WebAssembly is gaining really, really fast. But general talks like this, books, or blog posts are often very focused on WebAssembly. So it's easy to think that Blazor is WebAssembly. But I think we need to lift server and hybrid as well. So let's do that. There are 3 hosting models. We have Blazor Server, we have Blazor WebAssembly, and we have Blazor Hybrid. It's only small differences when it comes to what you have access to. So with Blazor Server, you have access to internal resources like databases, for example, or server resources like the CPU. With Blazor WebAssembly, you have access to local resources, so local computing power through the web browser. Blazor Hybrid can access local resources, but not only through the web browser, but also directly like Bluetooth, the flashlight, or whatever it may be on your phone, for example. So let's dive into Blazor Server, just so we can see and have the same understanding of how things work underneath. So what is actually happening with Blazor Server is that it's running your Razor component. Then, whatever that renders, we're going to get Blazor is going to take that information, create something called a render tree. And in this case, let's say that we have a header and a button. Now on the browser side of things, we will have a DOM and a little piece of JavaScript. The JavaScript is then going to connect the browser to the server using SignalR. So the changes is then going to be pushed over the SignalR connection to the JavaScript, and the JavaScript is then going to update the DOM. Awesome. So let's say that I click the button. That event is going to go to the JavaScript over the SignalR connection over to the Razor component. The Razor component is going to take that information, reload the page, do the necessary changes. In this case, a very subtle change. I just changed the Blazor rules with a Z to an S instead. Now it knows what the browser has because it knows what it pushed over the connection. So it's only going to push the changes. So it's only going to push the Blazor rules change over to the JavaScript, and the JavaScript then going to update the DOM. That's pretty cool. Now, this representation is not entirely true because what is really happening is not going to push over the H1 tags. It's going to push over way smaller amount of data. So, on the browser side of things, it looks a little bit different. But before we go into that, we need to understand how WebAssembly works. So, with normal browser interaction, so with normal JavaScript, we are going to download the JavaScript, we're going to parse the JavaScript, and then we're going to compile the JavaScript. And then the JIT interpreter is going to be able to run the code. But with WebAssembly, we can bypass some of that data, or some of those steps, and go directly into the JIT interpreter, because the JIT interpreter can run WebAssembly. So what Microsoft did was they took the Mono runtime and they compiled that to WebAssembly. And here's the really amazing part. Because the Mono runtime is running your .NET DLLs as well as the DLLs from the .NET framework inside of your browser. I had very mixed feelings about that, but it's running, it's actually running the .NET DLLs. It's running the same DLLs that we just did on the server. It's an amazing technology. Now, what you can do as well is that you can skip the .NET runtime and bake everything into WebAssembly. So with .NET 6, we got an option to do ahead of time compile. So the compiler is going to take all the DLLs, all the functions that we need, and compile that to WebAssembly as well. That means that the WebAssembly file is going to be way larger, but we're going to come back to footprints and stuff like that in a little bit later. So this image is how Blazor Server worked. We just saw this one. So with WebAssembly, it looks a little bit different, but not that much. The real change here is that everything is now running inside the browser. The .NET.wasm, the WebAssembly version of the Mono runtime, is running the Razor components. Blazor takes over, creates a render tree. We're not using SignalR anymore. We're using JavaScript interrupts instead, talking to a little piece of JavaScript, updating the DOM. Because WebAssembly can't access the DOM directly, so it kind of works in a similar manner as with Blazor Server. So what about Blazor Hybrid then? Well, again, let's show the browser version, the WebAssembly version. The Blazor Hybrid would look something like this. So now, instead of running inside of the browser, we are running on iOS, Android, macOS, Windows, or Tizen. It's running inside the .NET MAUI shell, and it's running on top of .NET or .NET for iOS or Android. We still have our Razor components, and nothing different with the Razor components. We have the Blazor framework. We have the render tree. We have the DOM. And we also have an option to use native components inside of the same application. So all of this means that I can take my Razor components and using Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly, I can reach the web or the browsers. With .NET MAUI, I can reach iOS, Android, macOS, Tizen, and Windows. And with WebView, I can even reach more things when it comes to the Windows platform, like VPF and WinForms. I want to show you a little bit of what Blazor looks like. So we're going to take a look at a to-do app because everyone loves a to-do app. I've called my to-do app Mana because to-do. I really like puns, okay? So let's take a look at that. All right, here we are inside of Visual Studio. And I have a project called manamana.razor, which is our shared project. So here's where we're going to put all our shared Razor files. We also have a MAUI demo, we have a server demo, and a WebAssembly demo. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a to-do list, so a list of to-do items. So let's start with that. Let's create a list of to-do items. So this is going to be a list of to-do item. Now the to-do item only contains like name and description and is done. We're not going to go into that. Let's call it items. Now the second thing is that we need to access our service. So I've created a service that we will be able to access our backend. So let's add that. So I type @inject. This is how dependency injection works with Blazor. So I'm going to inject a to-do service, and I want it to be called service, like that. Awesome. Now, when we load our page, we need to that page needs to get all of the items and fill the list. So let's do that. We're going to override a method called onInitializedAsync. And we're simply going to say items equals await service dot get items. And we're going to call the base class as well. There we go. So simply put, what we're doing here is that we are getting the information from the server and putting it into the items collection. Now the third thing, or the fourth thing we're going to do is we want to add the items to the list. We want to add the list, show the list. So we're going to use something called virtualize. And this is a new component that came in .NET 5 or 6, 5, I believe it was 5. Which is going to render, it's going to render all the posts. You can think of it as a for each loop, but it's actually only rendering the items that are visible on the screen. So anything above, anything below, it's just going to be a div taking up the space. So the scroll bar is going to work as we could expect. So virtualize items equals items. So we're setting the items property to the items list. And then I can write context item. So this is the same way that we can write for each var item in items. So the var item is the context basically. So inside of virtualized component, I can now use item for one single to-do item. So then we're going to have an li, we're going to create an input field. Now this input field is HTML, ordinary HTML. I'm going to say that it should be a checkbox. And I want it to bind to the item.isDone. So when I check this box, it's going to update our list and our item with the correct, whether or not it's done or not. And when I on-click it, so when I click the item, as you can see, I'm using an @ sign, @bind, @onClick. These are Blazor methods or functions, events even. So on click, I want to run a method that is called update item, and I'm sending in the current item into it, like so. Then I want to show the title. So I'm going to add a link to a page to do / and then the ID of the item. And I'm going to show the title, like so. Then we're going to have a button. So in this case, it's going to be just an ordinary button, but I'm going to add bootstrap clauses, btn and btn danger, because this button is a little bit more dangerous than any other button. And I'm going to say on click, so just as we did with update item, I want to run another method called delete item, like so. And the button should say delete. And at the end, I'm going to close off the list item and close off the virtualize like that. There we go. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to, in the update item method, we're simply going to call our service and send in the item like that. With the delete method, on the other hand, we have a small piece of JavaScript here, which says show confirm. So the name of my JavaScript is show confirm, and it's running the JavaScript method confirm. So what I now can do is I can go into the delete method here, and I can say IJS object reference. I'm going to wait the runtime, and I'm going to invoke a JavaScript method called import. This is the same import that you're using in JavaScript if you're used to that. And what I want to import is the file content. So if I'm saying _content, Blazor knows that, okay, so this is content that lives inside of an assembly. So _content tells Blazor that. The assembly name is manamana.razor because that's the file we're in. It's in the pages folder, and it's called todolist.razor.js, like so. So this is something called isolated JavaScript, and it lives together with the JavaScript, the Razor file, which is the really cool part in all of this. So then I want to do a call to our show confirm. So I'm going to use my reference. I'm going to invoke. I'm going to expect back a bool, and I'm going to run the show confirm method. And I'm going to send in, do you really want to delete this? And if I do, I'm simply going to run the service.delete item method, delete the item, and then I'm going to delete the item, and then I'm going to run state has changed. So simply what's happening here is that I'm deleting it from the server, I'm deleting it from the items list, and then I'm saying, you know what? This is happening on another thread. Could you please update the UI for me? And then it does that. Now I don't have a reference to the JS runtime here, so let's do that. Let's go up here, and I want to add the JS runtime. Same thing here, inject IJS runtime, JS runtime. Now, to make this a little bit more interactive, let's add a title as well. So I'm simply going to do an H2 here, my items, and then I'm going to do an @ sign. So when I do that, we're transferring everything over to C# land. So now I can write C#. So here I can say items dot where they're not done, count them, and end. So here you can see that I'm mixing HTML with C# code, which I think is kind of mind-blowing. So let's take a look. If I run this application, let's see what happens. There we go. So we have our application here. We go to our to-do list. I have 2 items here already. I do not have a raccoon. I have a book with a raccoon on the cover, but I don't have a raccoon. But let's say that I do. So I'm going to click that. So if you see my items up here, you'll see that it counts down. Nice and easy. So now I have some interaction happening, and I can press delete. Do you really want to delete it? No, I actually do want to get a raccoon. So let's keep that one. And I can click the link and I can get into another page and show that information. Okay, so that was Blazor Server. So let's go down here to WebAssembly and set that as a startup project and run that. So as you can see, when I load the page, you'll see that there's a little bit of a progress bar and then the page loads. A little piece of progress bar and then it loads. So if I click the to-do list, you see that I have the same to-do list. I can remove the raccoon, I can delete it. Everything still works just the same. And all of that code is in the shared library. So it's the exact same DLL running inside of the web browser instead of on the server. That is kind of cool, isn't it? Now, it takes a little bit of time to start up the Maui project. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you a small video of that running. But from here, from the .Maui project, you can run different platforms of Android, iOS. It's a little bit small, but you might see it here. So Mac OS, Tizen, and Windows. So let's go back to the deck and I'll show you what it looks like running. All right, let's take a look at what it looks like running in the Android emulator. So this is the Android emulator. It's running the same template. I can click the to-do list. I'm getting the items. Now, this was the first time the server was called, so it took a little bit of extra time until the items was returned. In this case, I'm not supposed to get a raccoon. I'm supposed to get some Legos, but that's amazing as well, right? And it works the exact same way. I think this is really, really cool, to be honest. Now, one of the promises with Blazor is that there's no more JavaScript. Now, this is perhaps a myth. It depends on where you're coming from. It's definitely going to be less if you come from an Angular or React world. But remember that JavaScript is needed. It's used for loading WebAssembly. It's used for interops and all of that. So it's definitely not going to replace JavaScript in any capacity. We need JavaScript to access browser resources, for example. Now, I come from an MVC and Razor Pages world, and for me, it was more JavaScript than I was used to. Now, having said that, I created my own grid component. I've built Bluetooth communication libraries. I have myself to blame, really. But in the early days of Blazor, you needed JavaScript to do simple things like changing the title, for example. All of that is built in now, and it's getting better and better every day. Now, it's still possible, as you saw, to run JavaScript with Blazor. So if you have your favorite JavaScript component and you don't want to stop using that, it's still possible. You can do that. Now, I wouldn't recommend mixing and matching all of these different languages. I think it's better to have a clean solution, have components built natively with Blazor, but it's possible. So what you can do, you can leverage web components. So you can add JavaScript libraries and create web components that you can just use inside of Blazor. You can use JavaScript web components in Blazor. You can use Blazor web components in JavaScript or in MVC. And this works for both WebAssembly and Server, which is kind of cool. On our Coding Off the Work TikTok, I added a video saying that Blazor was production ready. And I got a lot of comments of things that were missing. So I got an awesome list that I could look at and see if we have anything similar in the Blazor world. So the first thing that I saw was Angular material. Well, we don't have Angular material because it has Angular in the name, but we do have Math Blazor and we have Mud Blazor and a lot of other frameworks that is using the material design language. Not going to be a problem. Angular Flex, we don't have that built in. Well, neither does Angular, I guess, but we have something called Flexor, which is a highly inspired by Angular Flex. They asked for Angular animation. There is a project that was called Blazor Animate, but is now inside of Blazorize. So we have that as well. Perhaps not as flexible, I don't know, but there are options. Unit testing was one of the things that came up, and we have BUnit. Eagle Hansen has done an amazing job for unit testing with Blazor. And that is the preferred way of doing testing with Blazor. Now, routing and HTTP came up. This is built in into the .NET framework, so we don't have to think about that. We also have directives. Now, directives, as far as I know and as far as I understand, we don't support that just yet. Pipes came up as well, and it's all about converting types and formats, but we do have that, but perhaps not in the same nice syntax as with pipes. But there are options, and I think that there's no, based on this list at least, there's no features that Angular has, for example, that is just missing and can't be worked around in any way. Now this is a very common question. Should I put my code in Razor files or should I put it in code behind? Well, it's really only different ways. The default is Razor, but it's kind of easy to move it to code behind. So when Blazor came out, I really wanted to have it in code behind, but I thought that, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to try to run it in Razor files, and it got me hooked. It's just way easier. It's more productive. I don't have to switch between different files. If you end up having way too much code in your Razor file, you might want to break things out into services or something like that, or you can always put the code in code behind. But I would say that give it a try, because separation of concerns is not a thing in Blazor when it comes to code behind or Razor file, because the code behind and the Razor file is going to be mushed together, compiled, and it's still going to be the same file. So it's not really separating anything. And it's really boosted our productivity to not having to switch files and look for them and expanding in Visual Studio and stuff like that. Another very common question I get is, what component library should I use? Now this is developers that are new to Blazor. So they're saying like, hey Jimmy, I'm just about to start with Blazor. I've never seen it. I've never used it. I want to do my first project this weekend. What component library should I use? And I don't know what that comes from. Maybe because there's a need to use component libraries in other technologies, I don't know. But for Blazor, I think that the best thing you can do when starting out, use the native stuff. Build your own components. Now, I'm not saying that you should build your own component library, but learn how they work, because then it's going to be way easier to understand how to use the other frameworks or the other third-party vendors. Now, there are lots of different vendors out there. We have Progress Telerik, DevExpress, Syncfusion, Radsun, Blazorize, Matt Blazor, Mud Blazor, and shameless plug, Blossom, which is the grid component that I've built. Some of these libraries are free, some of them cost money. But start with figuring out what you need. Test them out, see if they have the things you need. Do they look good? Does it solve your problem? Because in many cases, I find myself using some of these component libraries and I'm locking myself into some things that can't be solved. So try to think about what you need, try them out. You should definitely not build your own component library. These are all really good and it will save you time, but you need to choose the one that is right for you. Now, building a component library is a bad idea. It's a lot of work. Now, back when we started with Blazor, we used a component called datatable.net, which was, funny enough, a JavaScript grid component. And we had a couple of special needs from that. We needed to, for example, if the window was resized, we wanted to remove some columns in a specific priority way. That was not supported by any of the vendors that we found back then. We wanted to have negative numbers red and positive numbers blue. And instead of writing a template for every single place we wanted to use that, we built that into the component. Now, I wouldn't recommend that because it's a lot of work and you can check it out on GitHub and see how much code it's involved into that component. But you should use components. You should make your own components because in the old ways of building components, it was hard and it wasn't very common to build web forms components and stuff like that. It was definitely not every developer who did that, but it's different with Blazor. Blazor is very component centric. That's really the most important thing. You should think in components. Can this component be reused? But also, can I simplify the usage? So this is what we did. We took an ordinary HTML button and we added some bootstrap classes. In this case, BTN and BTN primary. This would be basically the whole implementation, right? Now, the problem is that I'm going to save a customer. What classes should I use? Is it the primary button? Is it the success button? Maybe it's dangerous to save a customer. So I have to make that decision. I need to remember what we as a group or a team have come up with. So what we did was that we created an enum. So it has a default, it has a save, cancel, delete, or whatever thing we might need. But as you can see here, it's using the BTN primary. 2 of them is using BTN primary. 2 of them are using BTN danger. But I don't have to think about that. I know that I'm saving a customer. I'm using a save button. I don't need to I don't have to make a save button. But I can have the enum save in there. Now, I don't like planning for the future that much. But what happened was that I upgraded Bootstrap, and Bootstrap changed some of the naming in what kind of classes I should use. I had to change that in one place, and it just worked everywhere. So this is a very, very good thing to think about. So build reusable components. If you find yourself writing similar code twice, try to see, can I do this in a more generic way? Can I create a component? Build helper components like the one I just showed you. Components that is just an abstraction on top of HTML that will simplify and streamline selecting the right classes for you. Now, this isn't always a 100% rule, but it's going to be so much easier. A very common question is also, does companies use Blazor? And the answer is yes. Most companies don't talk about it. Most companies doesn't talk about Angular or React either, to be honest. But big Swedish companies use it internally. I'm talking big as in top 10 largest companies in Sweden. Companies that you have heard of. I have many friends that are consultants and they see the same trend. They have lots of customers that are investing in Blazor right now. If you want to see a real world project, you can check out Jeff Fritz on Twitch, who is using Blazor for his Clip Talk web, which is a really, really cool and huge application. So let's talk about Blazor Server specific things. So when we started with Blazor, we didn't add a refresh button. So what does our users do? Yeah, they start clicking F5. And what is happening then is that it's going to kill the current connection. It's going to establish a new one, but the old connection on the server is still going to live by default for 3 more minutes. So what happened was that we had a problem with our SQL server. It was a little bit slow, and people started pressing F5. 100 people at the same time. F5, 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 nothing is happening. F5. So what happened was that our SQL server got even more load. It went even slower, and our web server ran out of memory. So add a refresh button in the UI. Don't mix Blazor and non-Blazor pages. Like I still have this part of MVC left in the application. Let's just leave that, because that is going to do the exact same thing. It's going to disconnect the connection and connect again and leave it for 3 minutes. In .NET 8, there are coming some really nice ways of mixing and matching WebAssembly with server and stuff like that. So it's going to solve some of these issues in .NET 8. Now, the feedback we got from our users was that nothing happened. So we came from MVC and web forms. The whole page reloaded and you saw that something happened. But with Blazor, nothing reloads. So we had to add some kind of notification saved. Now the feedback quickly switched to, why isn't this updating automatically? So suddenly our users thought that, you know what, this completely different system. I'm changing that system. Why isn't this other system updating automatically? Which is a huge shift from nothing happened to, hey, we want more interactivity. We want things to speed up, which is really, really cool, I think. So make sure that you notify your users, customers saved, indicate it in some way. I mean, this is something that Angular, React, or Vue developers are familiar with, of course. But if you come from Razor Pages or MVC, it might not be as common to think about these things. Now, when it comes to development speed, I would say that Blazor saved our project. We were only a few developers. We were 6 developers. And compare that to companies doing the same thing with 10 times more developers. In some cases, we found that rebuilding it in Blazor, instead of fixing the bug in MVC, was actually faster, produced cleaner code, and was easier for us to maintain. We also shared components between our projects, which sped up the development and unified the project, something that was not as easy to do with Razor Pages or MVC. Now, Blazor renders on the server, and you might have heard that Blazor Server is so slow because it renders on the server, it sends over the data over WebSockets or SignalR, and it really depends on what you're comparing it to. Now, if you have a bad or slow internet connectivity, yes, that might be a little bit wonky, if you will. But we've been running it for close to 4 years now in production, and we never got the feedback that it was slow. At least not related to Blazor, to be honest. But the cool thing is that it only sends the changes over. So it's definitely going to be faster than MVC or web forms. Now, depending on the JavaScript implementation, it might even be faster than JavaScript implementations. Because what happens is that the JavaScript framework is going to go over to the server. Let's say that we're going to download 100 items. So it's going to go to the server, get all of those items, sent back to the JavaScript, compare those to the DOM, and then update the DOM. With Blazor, the request is going to go back to the server. The server is going to get all of the items, compare them on the server side, and then send the change over. So if there's no change, there's basically no bytes going over the wire at all, or only the changes that is actually happening. It doesn't have to update the whole table. You can update just one row or one TD, if you will. I talked to a couple of developers at the conference I organized, and they were absolutely sure that we were going to use Blazor Server. But they had two things that was very important to them. It had to work where the internet connection might be bad. So basically, it should work offline. And it should handle millions of users. Now, there are two things that Blazor Server is really, really bad at, and that's exactly those two things. So Blazor Server is not for everyone. Definitely not. Is Blazor slow? Blazor Server slow, I should say? Well, never got that feedback from any users that we have. The developers I talked to, they were afraid that the initial download size of Blazor WebAssembly would be a problem. And we're going to come back to that in a second or two. So it's not going to be slow for everyone. If you have good infrastructure, Blazor Server will work great. But it's not the solution for all projects. So let's talk about Blazor WebAssembly. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, like the footprint and loading time. So I asked the Swedish Facebook group for coders, Code Monkeys, what are the things that you would like to have answered in a session like this? And there was one guy that was kind of hostile towards Blazor, and he said that, well, downloading the whole runtime is just insane. The amount of bandwidth needed for that's never gonna be a thing. You remember the previous conversation. So I thought, what kind of footprints do applications or webs have today? So Facebook had 16 megabytes of JavaScript. I'm just measuring JavaScript, not images, not HTML. So the JavaScript was 16 megabytes, a little bit more. Pinterest had 6.4 megabytes. YouTube had 4 megabytes. Twitter back then was 3.4 megabytes. Stack Overflow had 1.5 megabytes. Apple had 1.2 megabytes. And the Blazor demo that I just showed you was 1.2 megabytes. It's actually under 1 megabyte now because every update they do, they update the tree shaking, and they get rid of a whole lot of data. So it's not really, I would argue, about the download size. Now, granted, it was a very simple demo when it comes to the amount of data we're talking about with the Blazor demo, but still. But there are things to solve this issue. Now, if we assume that the amount of megabytes or kilobytes is not the issue, it's actually the loading time. We can solve that by adding a progress bar, for example. That will add to perceived speed, so it will feel like it's loading faster. We can use server pre-render, but that needs an ASP.NET server in the backend, so that might not be for everyone. We can use Jay Sakamoto's, a fellow MVP, pre-render library. So it's perfect for SEO, and it loads way faster. So when you publish your application, it's going to pre-render everything and create HTML files or HTML segments that will make your application feel a lot faster. And then it's going to transition to WebAssembly. So this is the code that Microsoft used for the quick grid sample, which loads super fast because you get the perceived sense of loading. And you can always use AOT, so ahead of time compile. It's going to be a larger file, so if your internet connection is really bad, that is not going to be the solution. But if you know that you have pretty good internet connection, it's definitely going to be able to load way faster. So I'm going to show you something that I built, my ZX Spectrum emulator. It's my hello world, basically. So let's bring that one in here. So when I was 7 years old, my parents got me my first computer, a ZX Spectrum. And that was a very defining moment for me, because this was the moment when I decided that I wanted to become a developer. I didn't sit down and starting playing games. I sat down and I wrote 10, print Jimmy, 20 go to 10. When I became a developer, I thought, would it be possible for me to write an emulator written in C#? It took many years, not efficient time, of course, but it took many years before I was actually done with the emulator. And this is the emulator running inside of Blazor. So it's my C# standardized ZX Spectrum emulator running inside of the web browser. So if I start this, you'll see that it loads. I can load up Manic Miner here. Now, you can't hear this, but I can. It even has sound. So I'm using JavaScript interrupts to send information over to the browser and get sound. So if I start the game here, let's see if I can do that. Enter. And I can walk around, I can jump, and stuff like that. Now, I built this emulator many years ago, and I've implemented it for Windows, for Xbox, for a lot of different platforms. And I have yet to this day not been able to finish the first level. I can't get past it. This is too much. It's too hard. I don't know. So please try it out and see if you can do it. I can not for the life of me get past the first level. So should we go all in Blazor? Well, the answer is always it depends. What are your needs? What kind of knowledge do your developers have? Is it production ready? Yes, it is. Should you invest time into exploring Blazor? Yes. Now, will it replace Angular, React, or Vue? Yes, for some developers, like me. I don't have to learn TypeScript, JavaScript, Angular, React, Vue, whatever framework is popular right now. I can stay inside of C# without context switching. So thank you so much for listening. And if you want to get in contact with me, please contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn or through my blog or whatever it may be. I would love to hear what you do with Blazor. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to help if I can.